All right, if there's one moral to that particular story, it's turn on your mic. Jeez. Okay, so this is a poem which will put us in the mind set. It'll connect Go Tell the Spartans with the Michael Hare Four Dispatches lectures, which are coming next. So this is Haldeman's poem Air Support. It's on pages 14 and 15 of the course pack. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to give you a gloss on it. Okay. Still hard to admit sweet pleasure in others dying. Remember when the jets sweep in, drop bright, acre-wide blossoms of gasoline. They would be long gone before the first scream, before the roasting smell. Burn, baby, burn, we'd say. And it was sweet. We owed them our lives, the jets, the choppers. And sometimes they collected. I can forgive them killing Frosty, shooting Hot Rod in the chest by mistake, mistaking us for Charlie. Delicate work for blunt instruments. What I could never forgive was the kindness, sending out a chaplain to whisper nonsense. Whisper, not to give away position. Over plastic-wrapped meat, while the chopper idles noisily. It's only going to Graves registration, where they sit you in a barber chair. Hammer rigor mortis from your limbs. Remove your useless jewelry. Inspect your wallet. Stitch up the big holes with a basting needle. Put you in a plastic bag inside a metal box for one last bit of air support. And how did they feel, the enemy, to see our bodies borne away in loud green beetles to silver jets to carry rotting meat across the sea? I guess to see us dead was sweet. I guess they still remember. Okay, so let me gloss this. So air support here, as I will talk about when we come to the dispatches lectures, refers to mostly support from jets that are going to be flown by Navy pilots, Air Force pilots, U.S. Marine Corps pilots, even the Army has an Army Air Force. So you may be calling on basically people in jets who may be flying for, it depends on who's in your area, basically, and who's been tasked to help you. So you get on the field phone and you call your commander, who would be 6 actual on the phone. So you say, 6 actual, this is, Lima 1, whatever. And they say, okay, go ahead, Lima 1. You're like, need a fire mission, grid coordinates, blah. It's bad. And you give your reasons. Charlie's in the wire, and something like that. So they're close, basically. The South Vietnamese are really close, or the North Vietnamese Army, depending on where you are. And so this has to be okayed by the actual, whoever that is, probably a captain who's at a fire base and is monitoring this kind of traffic and says, okay, fire mission, and then makes a call to the local jet force, whatever it is, Marine Force, Naval Force, if they're flying off a carrier, which may be closest, whatever's closest, and says, we need, napalm drop at grid coordinates, blah. We've got, friendlies, many friendlies in right next to enemy in the wire. Be careful with the drop, blah, blah, blah. And so then the Navy or whoever the Air Force is sending it says, okay, mission on the way, we're Roger, we're a go. And so we're about, you basically have about 2 or so minutes until the jets arrive because they're close, right? Vietnam's a small country and you've got jet bases all over the country. Plus you've got the Navy standing offshore. And the jets are traveling at, Mach 2, so 1,400 miles an hour. I mean, they can go faster than the speed of sound, which is about 700 miles an hour on the ground in this very heavy, it depends, the speed of sound depends on what the medium is, right? So the thicker the medium, sound is going to travel differently than if it's, say, the stratosphere. Anyway, so these jets are traveling supersonic, right? They're going more than the speed of sound. So they can be there very quickly. They're covering, let's say they're covering, 1,000 miles. It's like, oh, okay, well, they can do that in about a minute, so they're going to be there. So, because they're flying supersonic. Okay, so they arrive, and this is what happens, right? Remember, when the jets sweep in, drop bright acre-wide blossoms of gasoline. So here's this idea that the explosions look like flowers from above, and it's very common for people to observe this, especially in bombers, where you look down and see these sort of flowers. They often talk about flowers of explosions. They would be long gone, but then the jets are gone. If they arrive, boom, and they're gone, right? Before the first scream, before the roasting smell. So they actually are close enough to hear the enemy dying and screaming and burning flesh, burning human flesh. And there's this combination of rage and relief, rage at the enemy and rage at being caught in this position and relief at not having to be killed and, relief at having been saved. And just sort of like an ecstasy, sort of exhilaration at having been preserved, one more day. And then they like burn, baby burn. It's like, just like get them, like this incredibly deep, passionate response that comes with terror. And it was sweet. So here's the soldier who's really struggling with this. We owe them our lives, the jets, the choppers, because you can also call for a fire mission that would have come from, say, a gunship. So chopper, a fully loaded gunship comes in, they can make the enemy back up. And sometimes they collect it. That is, there are times when basically an Air Force, not an Air Force, but a flying mission of one kind or another produces friendly deaths. And this is something that I, again, will take up in, I think, here the second, I can't remember, the first or second lecture of Hare. So that is, they actually kill your own guys. And it's just sort of a known fact amongst the troops that this happens, but it isn't generally known in the civilian world as much. The belief is that if your guys get killed, that the enemy must have killed them. It seems a little dim in here. I've been trying to fix this all night, and it's like, jeez. Okay, that's a little pinker. Okay, so then he goes through, the people who basically have been lost this way. Frosty, Hot Rod. Delicate work for blunt instruments, because it's kind of like saying, I need to fix my grandfather's pocket watch, and I've got this hammer. I'm like, okay, it's going to be, unless it needs a lot of really heavy work, it's probably not going to be very good for the watch. So you don't call on these weapons unless you're desperate or terrified or both. But then, the soldier stops, because what he can't accept is the hypocrisy of sending out a chaplain who's going to whisper a prayer so as not to give away the position. And meanwhile, there's a helicopter idling right there to take the chaplain back off the field, because the chaplain is not a shooter. The chaplain should not be able. The chaplain may be in combat, but is not allowed to pick up a weapon. And as soon as a religious person picks up a weapon in the Geneva Convention militaries, you're no longer a religious person. And that's it, because the idea is that the religious designated person will not fight. That is, will not fight to kill. And so there's this hypocrisy of like the body's over, right? And the person's finished. The body is just the body. It's just plastic wrapped meat. And the meat is only going to graves registration. And this is why we'll talk about this in coming lectures, where the Americans take the dead and they do their best to identify who they've got. And this is what the dog tags are for. But increasingly with high explosives on the battlefield, you may or may not be able to identify who you've got and whether you've got the right parts. And you might have a head and torso connected, but you don't have any limbs. And so this is something which Barth takes up in, you're trying to make sure you get the right number of limbs into a casket. Then you close the casket and it's not allowed to be open in the United States. And they're going to hammer rigor mortis from your limbs, and there's this, get rid of sort of all your effects because you're dead, right? And the body is treated very roughly in the sense that, you use these big needles and big basting stitches to try to keep the body together. And then there's this inversion, where air support meant basically dominance, American dominance, over the battlefield, apparently, it becomes that air support is now what is carrying away your body. And it's not just going to carry it away, as he says in Loud Green Beetles, to Silver Jets, but it's going to carry it away in Silver Jets back to America, because unlike World War One and World Wars One and Two, where men were buried where they fell or in local cemeteries, which were often mass graves. I mean, nobody likes to admit that, but there are those neat rows of crosses. There's a mass grave underneath there, likely as not, because there were so many deaths. That's World War One I'm thinking of. But same thing happened in World War Two. But in Vietnam this changed, and they were like, no, we're going to rehome, that is, as they call it, every single body. So all the bodies were returned. Now, as I say, people might not actually get the right body, and they would be instructed not to open the casket, or the burnt remains might be burned beyond recognition, that kind of thing. So he then inverts things. So he sees, the final air support mission is carrying the dead away to America. And then what would the enemy think of that? Seeing that not only were they pulverized on the battlefield by the helicopters and the planes, which the Americans had, which the Vietnamese did not have, not in South Vietnam. There was no air combat in South Vietnam, and there were no helicopter battles because the South Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, that is, and the North Vietnamese Army didn't have helicopters, so that didn't happen. And there were a few fixed-wing aircraft, but they were spotter, that is, small, slow-going, like Cessna-type aircraft, as opposed to the fighter jets, which are, some of the most expensive high-tech pieces of equipment on the battlefield. Okay, so what do they think? When they see these planes taking off, which would be full of the dead. I mean, some of these transport planes just had the dead on board. That would be it. And the same thing happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they would just load a C-130 Hercules with dead, and that'd be it. That's all they'd be carrying, plus a couple of crew, obviously. And so then it's a sort of complete circle where at the end of the circle, instead of winding up back where you were, you wind up in the enemy's position where they're looking up and seeing the dead being carried. And it's such a bizarre thing. It's like, wow, they're using their power to carry away the dead. Where they were trying to kill us, now they're carrying away their dead. And so I guess to see us dead was sweet. So there's this echo at the end of the poem, of the middle of the poem, right? So if you go back to the fifth or so stanza, which begins, and it was sweet. And it was sweet. We owe them our lives, the jets, the choppers. I guess to see us dead was sweet. And then I guess they still remember, because the memory is on the third line, right? Sweet, because the word sweet, you can pick up whenever you're looking at poetry. You're like, what does this thing mean? It's like, look for words that are repeated, because probably they're going to be repeated very, very deliberately. And poetry is like jewel making. It's very, very fine, and it's very particular, and you hold the language in a very particular, very careful way. So if writing a story is a piece of short fiction is careful, writing a poem is like creating a diamond. Basically, it's extremely careful, and the shorter they are, the more precision each word requires, and each phrase requires. So here, the word sweet, hard to admit, sweet pleasure in others dying. And then you get the jet sweep, right? And then, and it was sweet. So there's this return to the word sweet. Then we move on from that to sort of the reality of graves registration. And then we come back to the penultimate line, right? Is nearly not the last line, the ultimate line, but the penultimate line, nearly the last line, the one line, all but one, the last line. I guess to see us dead was sweet. Right? I guess they still remember it, and we have to go back to these first three lines. Still hard to admit, sweet pleasure in others dying. Remember when the jets sweep in, drop bright acre-wide blossoms of gasoline. And so you have to remember this. and they will have remembered our deaths. So there's this, and Haldeman often does this kind of thing where he's looking for connections between people and subjects that we may not initially think are connected or interconnected, but they are. And one of the strengths of his poetry is that he's going to find those connections and he's going to work on them and push us to, oh yeah, damn it, there's a connection here. There may be more. We may have more in common than we first knew. Okay, that's it for this particular poem.